Hello and welcome to Drydock episode 70, and this is the episode where we finally get the winners of the light cruiser design competition, so hold on to your seats. So just to remind everybody, this was a competition where you had 16,000 tons total displacement, pre-World War I light-scout cruiser, and you had to come up with a design that you could build multiple of within that displacement, i.e. so your maximum displacement would be about 8,000 tons. So because it would be unfair to compare ships of massively different displacements, I decided each category would have its own winners. And so you've got ships that are about 3,000 tons, you can build about 5 of them. Ships that weigh about 4,000 tons, because you can build 4. Ships that weigh about just over 5,000 tons, because you can build 3. And ships that weigh up to 8,000 tons, of which you can build 2. So in that regard, the lesser entered categories were the really big and really small ones. The winner of the biggest category, that's the category with that's up to 8,000 tons where you can only build 2 of them, is USS Hudson with its miniature Hawkins layout of 6 7-inch gun broadside, 6 torpedoes, 31 knots, 4-inch belt armor. I did like the note that they were using the 7-inch guns recovered from decommissioned pre-dreadnoughts. Then you've got at the other end of the scale the HMS Pomone with 4 5.5-inch guns broadside, 12 torpedoes, 27.5 knots, a bit slower there, 3-inch belt armor, but you can build 5 of them, and that's a category with that again noted the 5.5-inch gun was much more quick firing than the 6-inch gun, and between that and their torpedo armament, the kind of almost giant destroyer kind of layout fits very well with their intended use, which would have been at that displacement leading destroyer flotillas in a manner very much akin to the Arethusa class. Then the second most popular category was the roughly 4,000 ton displacement category. This is where you can build 4 ships for your 16,000 tons, and there were 2 candidates that stood out very well above almost all the others in this category, and that was USS Trenton and HMS Crusader, or HMNZS Crusader, whatever. And both these ships carried 6 torpedo launchers. Both ships had 2 inches of belt armor. Crusader's slightly slower at 28 knots as opposed to Trenton's 29 knots. And Crusader carries a heavier broadside of 4 6-inch guns as opposed to Trenton's 6 5-inch guns. Well, heavier in terms of guns. Overall broadside weight, I think the Trenton has a slight advantage because of the multiplicity of barrels, but never mind. They're both within about 100 tons of each other, and both are very good designs, so you're both winners. And then finally, the most popular category, ships of a displacement of just over 5,000 tons, which meant you could build 3 of them. And although there were 4 very strong contenders for a prize position at this point, I ended up picking a first, second, and third for this particular entry, and that is the USS Bismarck. Whoever sends these designs in for these competitions keeps naming their American design USS Bismarck, which I find quite amusing, but this time it has one. Also, the Zeeland, Dutch cruiser, and the Lissa, an Austro-Hungarian cruiser. They've all got similar broadsides. Lissa 7.6, approximately 6-inch guns, Zeeland 6 6-inch guns, and Bismarck 7 5-inch guns. Torpedo armament varies dramatically. Bismarck has 12 torpedoes, making up for its slightly lighter guns. Lissa has 4 lightweight torpedoes, and Zeeland has 6. Speeds all in the 28 to 30 knot range. Belt armor's a little bit all over the place. Bismarck has 3 inches. Bismarck has 2 inches. Zeeland has 3 inches. Lissa somehow gets 6 inches on there. So the Lissa class, although the slowest and having the fewest torpedoes, is basically a floating tank as this kind of displacement category goes for the period. So Bismarck, Lissa, and Zeeland, Trenton, Crusader, Pomone, and Hudson. If you are the designers of those ships, then email 5minuteguides@gmail.com. The About section of the channel should now have that available to just see, copy, and email. You all have prizes waiting for you, and prizes can be channel logo teapots, ship models, books, and there's a few other bits and pieces I can probably sort out as well. So let me know, and onwards with the next and final for this year competition. And today's video-based questions are taken from the video on the Battle of Tsushima and the video on HMCS Bonaventure. So let's get on with those questions. Lost Ship asks, will you ever cover ancient battles? I don't see why not, as long as I can find sufficient reference material to give a comprehensive picture of what was actually going on. Obviously, records from those times are, shall we say, just a little bit less extant than 20th century and late 19th century stuff. But some of the bigger battles, like Actium and so forth, as pictured here, are relatively well documented. But you'd be surprised, there are actually a significant number of battles that were very large and pretty important, but all we really know about them is that they took place, and roughly who was on what side. Most of what actually happened in the battle is quite often up for a lot of debate. Warren Lemkula asks, if Churchill and FDR had stuck their top naval architects in a room, what sort of aircraft carrier would they have come up with in 1941? Well, in 1941, the Royal Navy was just finishing off the final touches on what would eventually become the Audacious class, and were moving on to start work on what would eventually become the Malta class, which of course never actually occurred. Whilst in the USA, they were just about picking up speed on the design studies that would result in the Midway class. The interesting thing, of course, being that both parties had taken a look at the other's carriers and kind of headed towards the other side's interpretation of things, with the Midways being determined to have an armoured deck on the basis, in large part, of the experience of the British armoured carriers and their survivability in the early part of World War II, whilst the Malta class were designed with the American-style open hangar deck to allow a much greater air group and faster launch of said air group. So I suspect that actually, if they'd been stuck in a room and told to come up with a single carrier design, it probably wouldn't have been too far removed from those two carriers. It probably would have been some kind of slightly strange hybrid of the two, I guess. But yeah, you'd probably end up with something along the lines of a very large armoured carrier that I suspect would have carried some kind of interoperable pedestal or barbette for anti-aircraft guns, which would then be fitted for each different nation as appropriate. So probably something like twin 4.5s if it was the British-built version, and obviously some version of a 5-inch gun for the American-built version. But you probably would have ended up with some kind of opened hangar deck, armoured flight deck behemoth that, say, probably would represent something of a hybrid between the Malta and the Midway. Jochen Hayden asks, what would have happened if Schnarnhorst and Gneisenau had turned to engage Renown rather than run away? I suspect probably nothing good for the German ships, considering two factors. One was that Renown had already started hitting them, which obviously gives it an opening advantage to any continuation of the action, which is very important, getting those first hits in. But secondly, all sides were taking damage from the storm, but Scharnhorst and Gneisenau especially were taking quite the pounding from the storm that was developing there. Renown ended up basically with reduced speed and some damage to a bulge, whereas the water that was coming over the bows of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau was swamping turrets, knocking out director firing systems, and in some cases slamming what was left of the charge cartridges straight back into the turrets, which is quite dangerous. So I suspect that between that and the fact that Renown's escorts were gradually catching up, and okay, fair enough, the firing accuracy of a destroyer's guns in that storm is pretty much nil, but they do have plenty of torpedoes, which, yeah, good luck spotting them in all the swell. I suspect that between the weather damaging them further and the destroyers incoming, plus Renown already having the range on them, it probably wouldn't have ended too well for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Yannick73 asks, how is your channel affected by demonetization? I guess this question was asked in the midst of various historical YouTubers getting significant demonetization on their channels, including the Great War channel. So it is a little bit weird, actually, with this channel. I haven't quite had the same level of problems that some other channels have had, but the ones I have had seem to be even more schizophrenic, to be perfectly honest. For example, there is, ironically, I've actually given the video this question was asked on, there are actually two versions of the video for the Battle of Tsushima. Remember, this video was a sponsored video, and one of them was never made public, but it is still there on the channel, made private for checking purposes. And literally the only difference between those two was the opening statement that I made about the video being sponsored was moved forward by about a minute. That's it. There was no actual change to the audio content. I just swapped two audio tracks over positionally. However, upon upload, YouTube decided that the one that I'd uploaded that had the sponsored content ad notification about a minute further into the video was perfectly fine for monetization. But the nearly identical video, which is the one you actually got to see, was not eligible for monetization. And I was like, what the heck? They are exactly the same video. But put it in for manual review, nothing happened for about a week, then it was confirmed by manual review, so I went off and found an actual human and spoke to them, and after about, I think, probably about a week and a half or so, the video actually got re-monetized after presumably somebody grew a brain cell, and then, yeah, it's been monetized ever since, and you can actually see, if you look at the analytics, exactly the moment they remonetized it, because all of a sudden it started getting recommended to people and the view count took off. Outside of that, it just seems to be random demonetizations for absolutely no reason. Maybe about a third of the videos that I upload get tagged as not suitable for most advertisers. But since I tend to upload them at least 24 hours in advance, I can usually put them in for manual review before they go live. So they either get reviewed shortly before or shortly after release, so there's not too much lost on those, although sometimes the bulk of any income on a video is lost because it reaches its natural maximum viewership well before they decide that it's actually suitable. And sometimes sometimes it'll be fine, and then weeks later it'll be tagged. Like, for example, actually, while I'm recording this, the video on Kamchatka, Guide 151, that was deemed suitable for monetization from the start. And today, which is 25 days after it was uploaded, it was randomly tagged as unsuitable for most advertisers. Obviously, I have appealed that. And then just looking through the list, I have had a relative degree of success with actually talking to somebody via YouTube chat to try and get some of these taken off of that. But for example, the USS Franklin video was deemed not suitable for most advertisers right from the start and has remained that way even after requesting manual review and talking to people at YouTube. The USS Brooklyn Human Voice video, apparently the Brooklyn class cruisers are not suitable for advertisers. Randomly, Drydock episode 58. The H-class battleship guide, H40 through H44, that's guide 111. The HMS Hood Human Voice, and now, recently, the South Carolina Human Voice videos are all apparently not suitable for advertisers for reasons that will probably remain unknown until the death of the universe. So, yeah. No one ever accused them of being incompetent, but schizophrenic may well be accurate. But generally speaking, once you can actually get through to a human, about 70–80% of the time they're actually useful. But they'll never tell you why they demonetized it, which is irritating. Clemmy67 asks, what happened to the surviving Austro-Hungarian vessels after World War One? So, the Austro-Hungarians, rather understandably, given their history, were not the world's greatest fans of the Italians, and so they tried to avoid their fleet falling into Italian hands, and, well, the Allies in general, but the Italians more specifically. So, once the war was very clearly winding down, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor basically just said, right, you over there, newly founded state, formerly part of various empires, which state would eventually go on to become vaguely Yugoslavia, but at the time was the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. They basically said, right, you get all our navy. And then when the war ended, it's like, navy? What navy? We don't have a navy. No, no, no. Those lovely Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs over there, they have a navy that they're very quickly repainting, but it's not ours, so you can't have it. But, well, the Allies didn't quite buy that. The Italians sent in a couple of their earliest manned torpedoes and blew up the Virbus Unitis. And the Allies mostly went, yeah, we see through you, gimme, and took a bunch of them away. So one of the Tegetthoffs got taken to France, got used for target practice, and most of the rest of the ships got divvied up between various, well, the surviving ships, I should say, got divvied up between various Allied fleets, most of which used them for target practice, accommodation ships, or just scrapped them. Andrew Hendricks asks, 2 questions. What non-major power had the strongest navy? Particularly World War One, World War Two, but Age of Sail as well. And second, has China ever had a decent navy? So, second question first. China and a decent navy? At various times, yes. Back when there was the Age of Sail, the Chinese, well, I know it sounds a bit silly in English, but the Chinese war junk fleet was quite substantial, and for the area, quite heavily armed. They just had the misfortune of, when they eventually encountered pushy Westerners in warships, it happened at a time when Chinese technology in both shipbuilding and cannons had fallen somewhat behind European practice, and they ended up being rather badly set upon by various initially merchant vessels like the East India Company warship Nemesis. Yeah, Cyberpunk has nothing on, dystopian Cyberpunk especially has nothing on the early 19th century. Anyway, you then also had, towards the later end of the 19th century, as you can see here, the attempts by the Chinese to update their navy. This particular one is the Beiyang fleet. And again, China then had a pretty decent navy on paper, with a couple of nice battleships and a couple of squadrons of armored cruisers. The Chinese should have taken the Japanese navy completely apart in the, the iteration of the ongoing Sino-Japanese war that they happened to be fighting at that point. But as we will eventually cover when we get around to covering that particular battle, a combination of poor training, corruption, etc., in varying forms and varying degrees, basically meant that the on paper massively superior Chinese fleet got pretty badly mauled by the Japanese. And as for non-major power with the strongest navy, well, it's difficult to determine exactly how you define non-major power. I suppose if you mean non-major traditional naval power, so if you exclude Britain, France, and Russia, who were basically the contenders for top dog of the maritime world once the Spanish had kind of bowed out of things, bearing in mind that the Americans and the Germans wouldn't really begin their march towards having a massive navy until the very end of the 19th century, well, with occasional pop-ups from the Americans previous to that. But anyway, the Ottomans were not a non-major power. They were considered a great power, but they were primarily a land power, that you don't really tend to think too much of the Ottoman Navy, but the Ottoman Navy was a fairly considerably strong force at various points. They never really quite got their back together back after Lepanto way back when, but they tried. You've got to give them points for trying. They had quite the substantial Age of Sail fleet. Then the Russians blew that up at Sinop, in an early display of shell gun firepower, albeit that you stack up the number of guns on each side, and the Russians were going to win that shell guns or conventional cannons anyway. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, during the ironclad era, the Ottomans made another major bid at having a strong navy and bought up huge numbers of ironclads, then discovered and pretty powerful ones, and then discovered they couldn't afford them. They couldn't afford to keep them running, so the whole thing rusted away. Then they tried again, bought some pre-dreadnoughts off Germany, didn't maintain those either, got sent packing by the Georgios Averov pretty much solo, and then in the 1910s they were going to try again with even more battleships, and of course those got taken over and became HMS Erin and HMS Agincourt in British service, and then the Ottoman Empire collapsed. So yeah, on paper the Ottoman Navy has at various points actually been quite powerful for a not particularly traditionally seen as naval force, but circumstances mean they either keep getting shot, having their ships stolen, or for various reasons, as I say, corruption and poor maintenance, having their ostensibly massively, on paper, superior fleet being beaten 6 ways from Sunday by, well, a single Greek armoured cruiser. And Otto Hikoamv, he says you can just call him George. So George says, what was the conventional thought on conning towers and other command positions between Tsushima and World War II? Well, as he goes on to point out in his question, there were quite a lot of different lessons you could take from the experience of conning towers at Tsushima. Rodzisvensky, of course, was quite badly wounded, and almost everybody else in his conning tower was killed, whereas Togo didn't use the conning tower and just went for a better view and obviously survived. And various navies took both of those lessons and tended to pick different ones, and also tried to implement different solutions to how they interpreted their particular favoured lesson. So you can see here on this lovely example of American battleship construction that the conning tower is positioned slightly higher than and just behind the second turret, the super firing forward turret. And so, a sort of summary of the views, some people thought, well, the problem with the conning tower is that it's actually too low down. It doesn't give the admiral a good view, and being low down near the hull of the ship, that means it's more likely to either be hit or be hit by splash and splinters, etc. So we need to move it higher. Other people thought, well, the fact that the conning tower was badly damaged, people inside were killed, just means the conning tower wasn't heavily armoured enough, so we need to make it stronger. Other people thought that the conning tower needed to be slightly better hidden to protect it in a slightly different manner, albeit obviously that was a problem with actually seeing where you were going, which is important. And then still other people took one look at it and went, well, the man in the conning tower got injured and everyone else died. The man who wasn't in the conning tower didn't die, so therefore conning towers are less useful. All of these and combinations of these were lessons taken off of Tsushima, and those lessons continued to evolve during the intervening period up to World War II. Some people also took the idea that whilst the conning tower in principle was good, since it was unlikely that the conning tower would survive, or rather the people inside the conning tower wouldn't survive any kind of major shell impact, that it should just be made splinter-proof and light shell-proof, but don't bother massively up-armouring it against battleship guns because it won't survive anyway. So this is where you get this whole variety of conning towers in World War II. However, there's probably just one navy that broke with tradition massively, that being the Royal Navy, because the American Navy, the Germans, and the Japanese all agreed that you should have some kind of heavily armoured command position to retreat to if you absolutely needed to. Whereas the British looked at their experience in World War II and thereafter, where despite providing some relatively well-armoured conning towers, British captains and admirals consistently refused to go anywhere near them, and would just complain about the fact that trying to command a battle from an open bridge was a cold and damp affair. Although, being British, I don't know quite why they were complaining about that. It's the natural way of things after all. But anyway, so by the time you got to World War II, having gone through various attempts through Admiralty instructions and everything to cram officers into the conning towers and force them there, and the British officers just turn around going, no. The British just gave up and said, you know what, fine. If you don't want a conning tower, we'll just take it away and we'll use the weight elsewhere, and then you won't have one, and then you'll be sorry. At which point the British was like, hasn't stopped us before. So, for example, the conning towers still existed on King George V, and the King George V class, but the armour was only about 4 inches thick. And on a number of ships that came in for modernisation and refit, they were just removed entirely. And likewise with Vanguard, the armour on the conning tower was basically just splinter-proof. It was kind of like, well, yeah, if you come under attack by aircraft and they're strafing you, you might as well go there, but no one actually seriously expected them to use it in battle anymore, in ship-to-ship action. Chris Hopwood asks, if the Lion class had been built on schedule, what would have been the next step for the Royal Navy? Would it have been more along the lines of a Montana, or larger, more like the Yamato? Well, we do kind of have an answer for this, in as much as there was a theoretical, at least, design for a battleship after they'd stopped playing around with what exactly can we twist the Lion into. So, if assuming the Lions had gone ahead on schedule, bear in mind the Lions were supposed to be whole-scale replacements for previous class. The King George V was supposed to replace the Revenges, and then the Queen Elizabeth would have been phased out by the Lions. So you would have had Lion and Temeraire built in 39, then Thunderer and Conqueror in 1940, and then at least one, possibly two more in 41. So you would have been looking for designs, but then probably would have thrown together Vanguard as well in 42. So you're looking at designs in 43, 44, at which point you're going to be looking at probably the early genesis of what would eventually become known in naval enthusiast circles as the 1945 battleship, for which, fortunately, I don't think anyone's actually bothered to draw up the insanity that it was, but the specs for Lion follow-ons, once you discard the rather ridiculous modifications of the Lion design, basically amounted to what can we build that will be proof against current and future threats. And bear in mind that by 43, 44, you're going to be talking things like Fritz X. They came up with a solution, and that solution was, the 1945 battleship, or the 1,000-foot battleship, which could best be described as a steel ingot that they put a Lion class's armament on. One variation had 12 inches of deck armor. They were they were basically making a gigantic armed floating block, even more so than normal battleships. And the reason for the slightly unconventional picture in there is to give some idea of scale, because of course in that picture there's an Iowa class in the background and there's a Nimitz class in the foreground. And the battleship that the British were thinking about at the end of the war, albeit not tremendously seriously, as a follow-on to the Lion class, would have been significantly closer in size to that carrier as opposed to that battleship. Yorkie KDS asks, who invented / first incorporated the angled flight deck, and what advantages does it give to a carrier? So the angled flight deck in its initial form was invented by the British, as were a surprising number of other carrier innovations in the World War II and immediate post-World War II environment. But in terms of advantages it gives, it specifically with jet operations, which obviously jets becoming a lot bigger and heavier, it means a couple of things. First of all, by having the angled part of the flight deck be your landing deck, it means that you can simultaneously launch and recover aircraft. Now, with propeller aircraft, this was possible to do with a simple straight-through deck, but those lighter and slower aircraft had shorter landing areas. Jet aircraft, as I say, coming in faster and being heavier, tended to need a lot more length of the ship. So this angling of the flight deck, combined with the invention of properly reliable steam catapults, meant that you could conduct flight operations off of the front of the ship using your catapults, whilst simultaneously recovering aircraft because they weren't going to run into the back of the aircraft that you were trying to land up front. Now, there's additional advantages to that, part of which is that if your aircraft comes in and has to abort at the last minute, it can relatively easy just ramp up the acceleration, fly away, and do a turnaround. Whereas obviously on the older carriers where you have the straight through deck, you'd run into the aircraft that were preparing to take off at the front, or you can only do recovery or take off exclusively. You can't do both. And then finally, because you are separating out flight and takeoff and landing operations so significantly, especially as you start to get the sponson type designs, which are pioneered on more so on refit Essexes and the later US supercarriers, you end up creating a bit of a gap because your catapults are generally forward of the island. By the time the angled part of the flight deck gets to the island, it's actually quite significantly further away from the island than a straight through runway would be. And so you've created this kind of dead zone behind your takeoff area, but to the right of your landing area. And it turns out this area is very useful for preparing aircraft for launch or recovering aircraft back down before you take them into the hangar. JB76489 asks, how were submerged torpedo tubes on capital ships used, and were they effective? So for the submerged tubes on capital ships, you've got to bear in mind that there is a divide in that respect. Most submerged tubes were fixed, so they, well, you don't really need much more explanation as to how that works. Some of them had a limited degree of traverse, but not a tremendous amount, which obviously helped with aiming, and that comes into how you use them. Where you could traverse, you would try and traverse, obviously. With battleships obviously tending to go broadside, that wasn't too much of a problem, but even when they were fixed and even when they were traversed, it's quite likely that you'd be needing to shoot at an angle that the ship's hull wasn't pointing in, at least by the time you get to the Dreadnought era. During the pre-Dreadnought era, there was entirely reasonably the expectation that ships might get close enough to fire torpedoes at each other and also would be manoeuvring hard enough that a fixed bow torpedo or similar could be brought to bear. But anyway, on a Dreadnought era capital ship, what you would do is you would set the internal gyro on the torpedo to turn the rudder by a certain number of degrees port or starboard for a certain amount of time, and that would bring the torpedo onto the course you wanted, at which point the rudder would snap straight and it would go motoring off into the distance in the direction you wanted it to. So, for example, let's say that you've got a fixed port and starboard torpedo tube, and let's say for whatever reason they are fixed at a 90-degree angle. If your battleship is broadside to broadside with the enemy and they happen to be directly broadside to broadside, you might think, oh, well, I can shoot straight at them. Well, no, because remember, both ships are moving, so if you launch your torpedo, the torpedo will end up crossing the path, well, crossing the stern wake of the enemy battleship some distance behind. So what you might do is say, right, well, I know if the torpedo rudder is turned 20 degrees to port, it will rotate at, say, 5 degrees per second. So if I want to shoot ahead, effectively what you're doing is a deflection shooting, except with a 2-ton torpedo. You would say, okay, well, it needs to be fired at an angle of, say, 60 degrees off of directly ahead in order for it to intercept the enemy battleship. So that's 30 degrees. So if it's a 30-degree difference from where we are pointing to where we need to aim. So given that it can traverse at 5 degrees per second, that means we need to tell the gyro to make the gyro turn the rudder 20 degrees to port for 6 seconds. So you'd launch your torpedo, and the torpedo would gradually turn left for 6 seconds, and then in theory, you hope that the gyro snaps the torpedo back off onto a straight line, and off it goes towards the enemy battleship. That's the very basic way that you would do it. In terms of whether or not it's effective, there were a surprising number of torpedoes fired by capital ship torpedo tubes, but as far as anyone can tell, there was only ever one hit, which was Rodney against Bismarck. And although it's very likely that that was a hit, it is still technically only a claim. So, in terms of effectiveness, more morale and intimidation factor than actual effectiveness, given the amount of money that was sunk into them and the vulnerabilities they represented. All in all, by the time we got to the Dreadnought era, they probably weren't worth the time, especially given that the flooding in the necessarily quite large torpedo areas, storage and firing areas, did cause the loss of, or near loss of, several capital ships, particularly SMS Lutzow, the Derfflinger-class battlecruiser at Jutland. Frederick the Greater asks, if someone were to design and build an Age of Sail era ship of the line with modern construction techniques such as computer-aided design, electric tools, metal screws and fasteners, modern understanding of hydrodynamics, hull shape and structure, etc., but still sail-powered, constructed of wood and armed with cannon, how different would it be? Would modern techniques allow for larger, stronger hulls able to carry more guns? Would you expect the ships to be faster or more manoeuvrable? And do you think the design would be relatively similar to older ships of the line? Well, we kind of have a half answer, albeit it's a frigate, not the ship of the line, in the modern replica of the French frigate Hermione. Now, obviously, they tried in that particular case to build her as close to the original plans as possible, but that said, they still managed to fit an engine, electrical cabling, heating, etc. in there. But there were some additional interesting changes. So, for example, a lot of the fixtures, fittings up to and including the deck, had to be bolted into place, whereas in Age of Sail times they would have used wooden pegs, but because wooden pegs can move around, this is no longer deemed health and safety conscious. Likewise, the mast, quite often, especially once you got into the late Napoleonic War era, where the bigger trees that were necessary for sort of full body masts or even step masts couldn't really be found, a lot of masts were made by simply banding together bunches of lesser trees or staves with iron hoops, kind of similar to how you'd make a barrel, except more solid. But whereas, again, in the Age of Sail times, it was perfectly acceptable to just use some metal hoops to bind a bunch of wood together. Nowadays, again, not health and safety conscious, and so they had to actually glue them all together. So those are some of the changes they'd have to make. Now, from the inference, you're asking about basically a wooden sailing ship armed with guns rather than necessarily a strict Age of Sail replica. Now, obviously, electric tools and such would accelerate the work very, very much. Computer-aided design would, and a modern understanding of hydrodynamics would allow the hull underwater to be better shaped, albeit that as long as you're looking for a stable gun platform to carry a lot of guns above the waterline, there's not going to be a massive amount of improvement that you can do to an Age of Sail hull plan, because, well, they had a lot of time to refine that. But there are certain things you could do. So yes, they certainly would be bigger. I mean, the Seppings and Simmons improvements with cross-bracing the hull meant that ships could go way beyond what they had been able to historically for most of the Age of Sail. So that certainly would help. And obviously, you can use iron or steel braces and beams instead of wooden ones, which means you can make the ship even stronger, larger and lighter. So again, it would get larger still, although at that point you're edging right up to the edge of what could technically be called an Age of Sail era ship, albeit that those kind of techniques were used right at the end. But with the hydrodynamic understanding of hydrodynamics, that probably would allow for a slightly better hull shape. Say not a tremendous amount, but if you're wanting to go with just appearance rather than full-on replica. You can obviously use modern materials for rigging, modern rope, modern lightweight materials instead of canvas for the sails. All of that would make it lighter, possibly, and obviously increase strength, which would allow you to then catch more wind, which would allow you to go faster. So yeah, overall, you could build quite the monstrous ship of the line, probably something maybe 160 to 180 guns comfortably, that could probably outsail most Age of Sail era frigates, and possibly outmaneuver them, although we won't put a question mark over that because, well, inertia is still a thing, no matter how modern you make it. But yeah, it's certainly possible to improve, but you'd have to be using a lot of modern materials and science to do so. And now on to the Patreon questions. Ross Richards asks, he says, having just put out a video on Moselle Kabir, well, that gives you some idea when he asked that question, seems like a good time as any to ask, if the Germans had managed to get their hands on the French fleet mostly or entirely intact, and ignoring the issues of rustling up crews who'd actually be able to operate these ships, how would this have changed the calculations for Operation Sea Lion, or would they instead have attempted to wrest control of the Mediterranean firmly from the British? Also, do you prefer War Thunder or World of Warships, and why? Well, in naval game terms between World of Warships and War Thunder at the moment, I'd have to say I prefer World of Warships. For two reasons. One, server population, and two, possibly related to that, the fact that War Thunder throws ships all together, all over the place, and it's just a bit silly, really. Yeah, if you're gonna make a game, then at least have some kind of sensible dividing up. It's not really any fun to try and take an motor gunboat armed with a few machine guns and 20mm cannons up against a full-on light cruiser. What on earth? You can't do anything, and they can one-shot you. For all the balance problems that World of Warships has, in most cases, you're not going to go up against an enemy that you're completely incapable of hurting and can just blow you out of the water without even so much as thinking about it. In fact, might even take you out via automatic secondaries in about 2 seconds without even noticing. Anyway, now I've said about that. Within the criteria of your question, as regards the Germans taking over the French fleet, in terms of the calculations for Operation Sea Lion, that Sea Lion is still not going to happen, because during the window when the Germans could have thought about launching Sea Lion, bear in mind both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were out of action thanks to damage incurred during the Norwegian campaign. Richelieu would not be complete in time, so effectively you're talking about adding the various older French battleships and Dunkirk and Strasbourg, assuming, of course, that Moselle Kabir doesn't happen and those ships aren't damaged or sunk. Now, it depends how far you want to depart from the original timeline, because there were a bunch of French vessels, as covered in that video, in Portsmouth, Alexandria, etc. So let's say we write those off, we just delete the Moselle Kabir thing, but say that the ones in British ports get taken out of the equation. And to be honest, they're mostly older ships, so it doesn't make too much odds. It means that the Germans have a couple of older a couple of older dreadnoughts and a pair of battle cruisers in the Dunkirks, plus obviously destroyers and heavy cruisers and such like. You've got a number of problems with that scenario in terms of Sea Lion. One is you've got to get them to the English coast. That means going past Gibraltar, that means fighting your way past Force H, and the composition of Force H, especially if the Germans have actually managed to secure the French fleet, including the ships at Toulon as well. Yeah, that's going to be a bit of a hard fight. The British can bring in much heavier units. There's nothing in that French force that's really been modernised. The older ships haven't been modernised to the extent that they can go toe to toe with, say, something like HMS Valiant. And while Dunkirk and Strasbourg are faster than the majority of the British fleet, they can't hope to stand up against something like Nelson or Rodney, and Nelson was a frequent visitor to Force H around this time. So it doesn't actually really change the equation for Sea Lion much, if at all. It's still an impossible task. However, given that the majority of the operational French fleet is on the Mediterranean side of the Straits of Gibraltar, if they'd attempted to wrest control of the Mediterranean from the British, i.e. cooperating with the Italians, or possibly even just giving the ships to the Italians, given that we are ignoring the issues of finding crews, well, the most immediate answer is they probably don't have the fuel. So the whole thing grinds to a halt anyway. But hey, if we're ignoring the ability to just spawn crew, then we might as well spawn some fuel for them to operate in as well. Now, that could be a major problem, because you add that to Giulio Cesare and the other modernized Italian dreadnought, World War I era dreadnoughts, and add Dunkirk and Strasbourg to the soon to come online Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, and now you've got 2 modern battleships, 2 modern battle cruisers, and near enough as makes no difference, half a dozen older battleships, plus a much strengthened force of heavy cruisers, which the Royal Navy was a bit short on, and plenty of light cruisers and large destroyers. That is enough of a force that the Mediterranean fleet and Force H cannot realistically fight them if they all come out in force, if with those 2 forces separated. Now, combined, fair enough, the Mediterranean fleet and Force H can probably maybe just about still give that force a run for its money, with the accuracy issues that the Littorio class had. But the Italians or Dash Germans would have to be monumentally stupid to allow those 2 forces to combine or pincer them in a single engagement in the Mediterranean. It'd be relatively easy to pick them off, which leaves the British with a bit of a catch-22, because they've got to either watch Germany, with obviously Bismarck coming online, or they've got to scramble reinforcements into the Mediterranean. So what that will probably mean is no Far Eastern effort, no Admiral Somerville chasing around with Admiral Nagumo in the Indian Ocean, because the Revenge class and Warspite are all going to be needed back in the Mediterranean. There'd probably be more than one attempt at a Taranto to try and knock out as many ships as possible in harbour, and they'd probably have to bring to an end the policy of putting the older battleships out on convoy escort duties. Now, they do have some advantage in that, at least initially, as we said, Schnarnhorst and Gneisenau are out of action, first with combat damage from Norway, and then after their one successful Atlantic cruise, they're then stuck in Brest and being bombed, then you've got the Channel Dash and so on. So they're not going to strengthen, they're not going to weaken the home fleet, but they very well might have to pull, well, basically everything else off of convoy escort duty in the Atlantic. So you might end up with, say, the only forces capable of responding to a German threat would be maybe Hood, Prince of Wales, King George V, Victorious, and maybe Duke of York once it comes online, and eventually other American ships like the Washington, and everything else. So all the available QEs, all the Rs, at least Nelson or Rodney. Maybe they keep one for the home fleet and one down there. And probably Renown and Repulse as well, I would imagine. Yeah, but effectively, with the entire British battleship force, and a fair number of the carriers will probably have to be concentrated in the Mediterranean. Because, as I say, if you're going to keep Gibraltar shut, you need a force big enough to resist there, and you also can't abandon the Mediterranean, which basically means that the British have got to maintain fleets at both ends capable of giving that combined Franco-Italian or German Franco-German controlled Italian force a run for its money. Which, as I say, was why they're probably going to try a lot of airstrikes to try and whittle that down. About the only advantage they've probably got is that even as decrepit and clapped out as some of the R's were, they're probably not in anywhere near as a bad state as some of the French early dreadnoughts, so they might still have a speed advantage. Tuning 3434 asks a very complex question about turboelectric drives, broken down into 4 approximate parts, and relating to the fact that modern warships have a large capacity of power generation on board. And so the 4 parts are: did other navies experiment as early as the US did to get more cruising efficiency? 2, how well did it perform in practice? And 3, did they practice, quote unquote, on earlier vessels, or is this really an early case of the military-industrial complex employing new exciting technology of large electric generators? And 4, what technological advances made them return back to turbines in the 30s? Or was it impossible to use a turboelectric drive on a fast battleship? So, well, in this case, this is quite a complex subject, so I'm actually going to go in rough order. The reason modern warships have a large capacity for power generation outside of their propulsion units is because of the massive proliferation of electronics on ships. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, pretty much the only electric systems you had to worry about were lighting and maybe fire control. Nowadays, you've got to worry about multiple high power capacity radars, lots more lighting, lots more electrical equipment. There's all sorts of wonderful electronic equipment on board ships, everything ranging from microwaves to heating elements to power tools and anything that can be plugged into a socket, all of which, plus a navigational radar, sonar, etc., all of which wasn't around at the beginning of the 20th century. And so all of these things, as well as radios and such like for communications, these all need to have electrical energy to keep them on, and hence why modern warships need this massive power generation capacity that's apart from their propulsion. So on to the main parts of the questions. Did other navies experiment early on to get more cruising efficiency? Yes, they did. A lot of the larger turbine-driven ships in the early part of the 20th century in the dreadnought race would actually have different sets of turbines, because turbines run best at certain revolutions, and early turbines ran best at very high revolutions, and so they would actually come with sets of both main drive and cruising turbines, which amongst various reasons was one of the reasons why a lot of early battleships ended up with 4 screws, and that trend continued for various other reasons because there were other advantages, but one of the big ones in the early part was if you had 4 screws, you could run 2 screws on full power turbines that would go at very high speeds. Obviously, this could help your ship run fast, but would eat up fuel like there's no tomorrow, and then you could have 2 other lower power turbines that would run at lower speeds, and these would be more efficient at the cruising regimen. So quite often when ships were cruising around at their sort of 12 to 14 knot average cruising speed, they would be running just on 2 screws, and then the other 2 would be brought online when they needed to go all in. So that was one way of doing it, just having different sets of turbines. Later on, they also brought in geared turbines rather than direct drive. So rather than effectively, well, here's the turbine, it's rotating at this speed, it's connected to a propeller shaft, that's how fast our propeller is going. And you can maybe play around a little bit with the steam pressure to vary that somewhat. You could then introduce the geared turbine, which, as it sounds, is a massive gearbox. This increased weight and space taken up by the engine room, which obviously was something of a problem. And it was, as you can imagine, with the amount of power generated by ships' engines and the associated turbines, quite the robust piece of engineering that you had to get right. That's slight intolerances in the construction or faulty materials or whatever, and you could get a very expensive shrapnel bomb effectively, because that much energy getting put through that much metal, it's going to go somewhere if it locks up and you don't have anywhere for it to go. So the geared turbines were sort of the next generation solution past the cruising turbines, although they still did keep in a number of ships cruising turbines even so, because of their lower power needing less fuel, which obviously then had separate benefits for efficiency. Now, part two: how well did turboelectric drives perform in practice? They performed quite well, actually. They made it much easier, especially in the early part when you were either looking at various styles of direct drive turbine, or in the USN's case, some early problems with actually manufacturing reduction gear boxes for turbines. It allowed them to completely control how you would vary the speed of the propellers, because you just vary the voltage going into the motors. So this is one of the reasons why the standard class was even possible, because even if you had slight differences between different ships and different classes, which were inevitable, you could just tune the output on the generators and therefore the motors to get your speed exactly in line with everybody else. You could also, because you were talking about multiple systems, because you've got your sort of the generators, the converters, the transformers, the motors, etc., as opposed to gigantic turbine, possibly gigantic gearbox, you could divide up the interior of the hull of the ship better. And obviously it meant you had loads of, and that's for anti-torpedo protection, and also you had loads of power, loads of electrical power. You could tap into that to run all sorts of other things like ice cream makers, which are obviously very popular. So yeah, it did impact the design in as much as you were able to make the subdivision internally somewhat better. And in terms of what the US Navy needed, especially because it allowed you to run run the turbines that are giving you the kinetic energy to run the generators that are giving you the electrical energy. It allows you to run them at the optimal running speed at all times, regardless of what speed through the water you're actually going, and that improves efficiency as well. In terms of did they practice on early vessels, i.e. were these kind of experimental things? Turboelectric drive was something of an experimental technology at that scale back then, but it certainly had been tested, refined, and wouldn't necessarily say it was entirely mature, but it was definitely known to be fairly reliable when they stuck it on the battleships. With the US Navy being so tightly squeezed for funds by Congress, they weren't particularly in a mood to waste what funds they did have on completely radical experimental technologies on something as vital as the propulsion plant, which might turn around to bite them very hard if it turned out it didn't work. Now, what technological advances made them return to turbines in the 1930s? This was a combination of things. Partly what the technology that drove the gearboxes for turbines had improved. They'd become more reliable, more efficient, lighter weight, and US designers, to be perfectly honest, had figured out how to make them properly as well. They were a little bit behind in that field, at least initially. But also there were a number of issues that, especially with the advent of more and more underwater threats like torpedoes and mines, the US Navy was beginning to look a little bit leerily at their turboelectric drives for, one of which was actually efficiency. Now, whilst the turboelectric drive was very efficient compared to multiple direct drive turbines of different power levels, once geared reduction turbines had gotten fully into swing, there was a rather major flaw in the efficiency train of a turbo electric drive, and that is that you have your boilers and they generate steam, and this is all to do with energy loss. So no energy transfer is 100% efficient. Basic thermodynamics for you. So you're burning your mostly oil at this point, so you're generating heat energy. That heat energy obviously goes into the water, which creates steam. The steam moves, and so you've lost some energy there, because obviously not all your heat from the boiler is going into the water to create steam. The steam moves along. The steam passes across the turbine blades and makes the turbine spin, which changes the energy available in the steam into kinetic energy, rotational kinetic energy to be more precise, in the turbines. And in a normal system, those rotating turbines obviously connected to the drive shaft, so that rotational energy and direct drive system goes into the propellers and then obviously into the water, and that's the end of your various steps of energy transfer. In a geared turbine, obviously some energy is lost in noise and heat and other inefficiencies in the gearbox, but still is supplied to the turbines. In a turboelectric system, however, there's multiple additional steps because the rotational energy from the turbines then has to get turned into electrical energy in the electric generators through obviously a magnetic coil induction, so there's an energy loss there. It then has to be transmitted through electrical cabling. There's some energy loss there, although it's not really a step change so much. It then goes into the motors, and the motors have to convert the electrical energy back into rotational kinetic energy, which is another step change, another lot of energy loss there. So as the system that both drive systems share, which is the actual sort of turbine boiler setup itself, improves, and as the gearbox improves, there's more energy step changes in the turboelectric drive in which energy is lost. So there's a higher ceiling of efficiency for direct drive and geared turbines as there is compared to a turboelectric drive. So eventually the geared turbines overtook the turboelectric drive in efficiency, and therefore it was considered a better bet to go with them. There was also the other problem that as ships got faster and faster, machinery got more and more powerful, if you're going to have a turboelectric drive, that means going to be a colossal amount of electrical energy floating around. And guess what electricity really, really doesn't mix well with? Yeah, that's right. Water, and very specifically water that has electrolytes in it that allow for conduction, because completely deionized pure water won't conduct, which is fun. But yeah, salt water has an awful lot of electrolytes in it. So yeah, getting salt water into your turboelectric drive system, very bad, because it'll short out and not work. And good luck repairing that. And two, I don't think most of your engineering crew or anyone in the vicinity of your gigantic metal ship is going to appreciate having the hundreds of thousands, if not more, volts of energy that you need to drive a ship suddenly being dumped into them and their surrounding environment tends not to go too well. And the machinery was obviously, when you're putting that much electrical energy through anything, as anyone who's run an electric motor for any length of time will know, builds up an awful lot of heat. So you've got to dissipate that heat, but at the same time you've got to keep out all the salt moisture to stop everything shorting out. Which obviously is a huge problem, especially when you're in a warship where, well, the enemy's going to be trying to let air and water in an uncontrolled manner. And whereas you can end up with doused flames, and if you're really unlucky, a boiler explosion, if your engine room gets breached on a traditional drive ship, at least you're not turning the entire rear half of your ship into a giant fly grid, except for humans. So there's that. So these and various other reasons are why the US Navy, once they had efficient geared turbines, went back to geared turbines for their fast battleships. And that concludes this episode of the Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again in another video.